January 11th, 1944, over Oschersleben, Germany. The sky was a graveyard. 30,000 feet above the frozen German countryside, the 401st Bomb Group was being torn apart. Black bursts of flak blossomed around the formation, shaking the giant B-17 flying fortresses as they droned toward their target. Frost crept along the glass nose of one bomber, Lucky Lady, as its pilot, Captain Frank Meyer, squinted through the gunsmoke. Bandits! 11 o'clock high, the tail gunner screamed through the intercom. Then they came sleek, grey Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds, cutting down from the Sunday. Within seconds, the sky erupted in chaos. Tracers streaked like fireflies. One B-17 took a direct hit to its wing. The fuel tank exploded, turning the aircraft into a spinning torch that plunged toward the clouds below. Inside Lucky Lady, Meyer gripped the controls. "Hold formation! Hold it!" he yelled, but his voice was drowned out by the pounding of flak and the shriek of engines. The P-47 Thunderbolts assigned to escort them were gone, forced to turn back hours earlier when they ran out of fuel. Now, the bombers were naked. Another German fighter screamed past the cockpit, its guns spitting 20mm fire. Shards of glass peppered Meyer's face. The intercom crackled with a final, desperate transmission from another crew. "Mayday! We're hit, bail out! Bail!" Static. By the time the surviving bombers turned for England, 60 out of 663 aircraft lay scattered across Germany. Hundreds of airmen were dead, burning in wreckage or falling in parachutes that never opened. At the debriefing that night in East Anglia, silence hung heavy in the room. The young crews, many barely 20, stared at the floor. No one spoke. The mission had hit its target, but at a cost so high it felt like defeat. Major General Karl Spaatz, commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, studied the losses with cold fury. "We can't keep doing this," he said quietly. "We're sending boys to die before they even see the target." He knew the truth that no one wanted to say aloud. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies over the Reich. And if that didn't change soon, Operation Overlord, the coming Allied invasion of Europe, would fail before it began. 2 weeks later, a small twin-engine transport plane landed at RAF High Wycombe, the nerve centre of the 8th Air Force. The door opened, and out stepped a man whose very presence seemed to shift the air. Short, compact, with steel grey hair, and the grin of someone who'd stared death in the face and dared it to blink. Major General James "Jimmy" Doolittle. He was already a legend, the man who had led 16 bombers off an aircraft carrier to strike Tokyo in 1942, a mission so audacious it bordered on suicidal. The newspapers called him fearless. His men called him crazy. Now Washington had sent him to England for a different kind of fight, one that wasn't about daring raids or headlines, but about survival itself. As he walked into the briefing room, the senior staff rose instinctively. He waved them down with a half-smile. "Sit. I didn't come here for ceremony. I came here to win a damned air war." Doolittle spread the mission maps across the table. Red lines stretched from England into Germany, routes soaked in blood. He pointed to the tiny fighter icons clustered near the bomber formations. "We're babysitting these bombers," he said. "We keep our fighters tied to them like dogs on a leash, and the Luftwaffe tears us apart anyway." A colonel cleared his throat. "With respect, sir, escort doctrine says we have to stay close to the bombers. They're too vulnerable otherwise." Doolittle looked up, eyes sharp. "And how's that doctrine working out?" No one answered. He straightened, voice hardening. "We're not here to protect bombers anymore. We're here to kill the Luftwaffe." The room fell silent. Some officers exchanged uneasy glances. But Doolittle was dead serious. He had a plan reckless, dangerous, and completely against regulation. And in a few short weeks it would break the back of Germany's Air Force forever. January 15th, 1944, RAF High Wycombe, England. The war room smelled of tobacco smoke and stale tea. Maps of the Reich lay spread across the long table, pins and faded pencil lines showing every route the bombers had flown and every place they had been cut to pieces. Outside, the English winter pressed against the windows. Inside, men argued in low voices about doctrine, fuel, and risk. Major General James H. Tees, Jimmy Doolittle, stood at the head of the table, the lines around his eyes deep from years at altitude and stress. He had that look of a man who'd already risked everything. The 1942 Tokyo raid still gnawed at the newspapers and the memory of a nation, and now he'd been given a new, bloodier problem. How to stop bomber losses that were bleeding the Air Force dry. "Gentlemen," Doolittle said, voice clipped, "we have one job. Win air superiority over Germany so the invasion can go." He didn't bother with small talk. He spread his hands over the map. "We're not babysitters, we're killers." Colonel Robert Johnson, an operations planner, cleared his throat. "Sir, Doctrine requires close escort. Fighters remain with the formation until the bomb's away." "Doctrine?" Doolittle snapped, cutting him off. "Doctrine got our boys shot down when the escorts ran out of gas at the Dutch coast. Tell me where Doctrine wrote a formula for common sense." The room shifted. The tension was not just about tactics, it was about trust, and about how far a commander could shove the rules before the system snapped. The 8th Air Force had, until now, accepted that fighters existed to shield the bombers for a portion of the route and then return to base. The Luftwaffe's fighters, though battered, still had enough fuel and skill to pounce when the escorts peeled away. The result was predictable carnage. Doolittle didn't need charts to prove the point. He'd seen the gory aftermath over Oschersleben and Berlin. He had watched crews climb back into English pubs and try to sleep next to nightmares of burning fuselages. "We change the objective," he said finally. "We stop thinking defensively. We go fight them on the ground, in their skies, on their airfields. We take the initiative." Eyes hardened. "How?" asked a skeptical brigadier. "Our fighters still don't have the endurance to escort the bombers all the way to Berlin." Doolittle smiled, but it was not a friendly expression. "Have you seen the P-51 inches action?" he asked. A murmur ran through the room. The Mustang had only recently begun to arrive in numbers, a lean, elegant fighter with the new Packard-built Merlin engine that transformed its high-altitude performance. With drop tanks, the Mustang's range could be measured in the thousands of kilometers rather than the hundreds. It could go where P-47 seconds could not. He laid his finger along the bomber corridors. "We use them differently." He tapped a cluster of airfield icons near Berlin. "Rather than tether our fighters to the bombers like lanterns, we unshackle them. We send groups ahead, beyond the bomber streams, to sweep the Luftwaffe out of the sky. We attack airfields, patrol their approaches, ambush them in transit. Above all, when they take off, we meet them." Silence followed. The plan was audacious and dangerous. It flew in the face of doctrine that had been painstakingly argued and refined for years. It exposed fighters to the risk of separation from the main force, of being caught deep over Germany with limited fuel and no friendly air cover. Many in the room saw court-martials in the margins of the plan. Others involuntarily imagined the headlines, "8th Air Force disobeys orders." Doolittle's hand went to a photograph pinned to the map, a formation of silver Mustangs cutting through cloud at high altitude. "They called me reckless in 42, he said softly, remembering the Tokyo raid. "They called me worse. But what matters is this. If we can stop the Luftwaffe at its source on the ground and in the air before they can climb and fight our bombers fly unmolested. You ask me, how do we reduce losses? I tell you, we hunt them, we go find them, we break them." Training began at once. Mustang squadrons were briefed not as strict escorts but as hunter-killer units patrol far ahead after bomber ingress, sweep lateral and rear approaches, and use range and altitude to choose engagements. Pilots were taught to coordinate strikes on Luftwaffe airfields at dawn and to intercept returning fighters on known vectors. Ground crews improvised fueling schedules. Logistics worked at breakneck pace to ensure P-51 seconds could be fitted with external tanks and still have safe return margins. Commanders protested. "What if they run out of gas?" one asked. Doolittle shrugged. Then they'll land where they can, or bail out. That's better than burning our bombers. When the first sorties under the new directive took off, the mood was electric and raw. Mustang squadrons peeled away from the bomber streams at an altitude that let them see far into German airspace. They swarmed German airfields with a speed and ferocity. Luftwaffe controllers did not expect P-51 seconds, strafed dispersal areas, destroyed aircraft on the ground, and ambushed fighters during takeoff runs. The air war's center of gravity shifted in a matter of days from defensive escort to offensive pursuit. In briefings afterward, Doolittle's language was blunt. "Don't sit under the bombers," he told a roomful of wary pilots. "Use them as bait if you have to. Draw the enemy into the open. Kill fighters before they can climb to us." Pilots returned triumphant, eyes bright. They spoke of hounding me 109 seconds from their own fields, of strafing parked Beyaf 110 seconds before crews could run out to start them. They reported Luftwaffe pilots refusing to take to the air unless backed by radar warnings and ground-controlled cover. Within weeks, those warnings came too late. The German fighter arm began to hemorrhage not just planes but pilots and morale. Doolittle's gamble had a name among the men who flew it: freedom to hunt. It was reckless by every manual, but lethal in practice. And in the cold calculus of war, lethality was what counted. February 20th, 1944, big week. Dawn broke pale and brittle over East Anglia. Frost clung to the wings of hundreds of bombers lined up in endless rows across the runways of England. Crews moved like shadows, loading bombs, checking engines, whispering quiet prayers into the morning fog. Today, the 8th Air Force would launch Operation Argument, a coordinated strike on Germany's aircraft factories at Leipzig, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg. But this time, something was different. This time, Doolittle's Mustangs weren't here to guard, they were here to hunt. From the tarmac, Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group climbed into his P-51B, its nose painted with a snarling red spinner. He tightened his oxygen mask and glanced toward the horizon where the first rays of light cut through the mist. "Time to make the bastards fight," he muttered. At 8, the sky over southern England filled with thunder. 1,000 bombers and 500 fighters lifted into formation. A living armada of silver wings glinting in the Sunday engines roared so loud the earth itself seemed to tremble. Doolittle stood on the control tower balcony, watching them disappear into the rising cloud. His chief of staff, Colonel Lawrence Cuter, stepped up beside him. "Sir, the Luftwaffe will throw everything they've got at them." Doolittle didn't look away. "Good," he said. "That's what I want." High above the clouds, over the Netherlands, the bomber streams pushed eastward, massive, tight-knit formations of B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, glinting like fish scales in the morning light. In past months, this was where the slaughter began. But not today. At 22,000 feet, P-51 Mustangs throttled forward, breaking away from the bombers in disciplined squadrons. Their radios crackled with Doolittle's new standing order relayed to every fighter group in Europe. "You are no longer tied to the bombers. Seek out the enemy. Destroy him wherever he is found." The formation broke into waves, sweeping out ahead of the bombers, some diving low to strafe German airfields near Hanover, others climbing to 30,000 feet to intercept the climbing Messerschmitts before they could form up. On the ground, German radar stations lit up like Christmas trees. Controllers shouted into headsets. "Achtung! Amerikanische Jäger über Osnabrück! 100! Nein, 200!" Ho! By the time the Bf 109 seconds scrambled, they were already under fire. Captain William Tex Hill of the 354th Fighter Group led his flight in a shallow dive toward a Luftwaffe base at Gütersloh. He could see them, the telltale silhouettes of fighters still taxiing, ground crews waving frantically. "Let's hit 'em where they live," Hill barked. He dropped his nose, guns chattering. 50 caliber tracers stitched across the runway, igniting fuel drums and aircraft alike. A Bf 110 burst into flame. Another flipped end over end as it exploded. Over the radio, someone laughed in disbelief. Hell of a way to start the morning. Within minutes, chaos engulfed the airfields. German pilots barely airborne found themselves ambushed by swarms of Mustangs diving from the Sunday. The Luftwaffe's well-drilled formations shattered into fragments before they could climb to the bomber altitudes. Meanwhile, over Leipzig, the bombers reached their target unchallenged. For the first time in months, they dropped their loads without the usual storm of interceptors tearing them apart. Anti-aircraft fire still barked from below, but the sky was eerily clear. In one of the lead B-17 seconds, Captain Frank Meyer, the same pilot who had survived the slaughter over Oschersleben weeks earlier, looked around in disbelief. "Where the hell are the 109 seconds?" he asked. His co-pilot grinned. "Guess they found other company today." When they turned for home, Meyer looked down at the distant fires burning not from bomb hits, but from destroyed German airfields far behind the lines. He didn't know it yet, but Doolittle's gamble was working. That evening, as the first returning fighters landed at Debden and Leiston, the air smelled of hot engines and victory. Mechanics rushed out to refuel. Pilots clambered down laughing, still buzzing with adrenaline. Blakesley's grin was wild as he yanked off his oxygen mask. "Sir," he told his operations officer, "we caught them on the ground. You should have seen it, me, 109 seconds, burning like torches." Losses were light, shockingly light. And more importantly, bomber crews had made it home. When the day's reports reached Doolittle's desk, the numbers stunned even him. Luftwaffe interceptors destroyed, 140. American bomber losses, down by nearly half. He stared at the figures for a long moment, then said quietly, "That's it. We've broken their rhythm." For the next 5 days, the raids continued day after day, deeper into Germany. The pattern repeated. Luftwaffe pilots scrambled, only to find Mustangs waiting. Airfields were left burning. Bombarlos plummeted. What began as one man's reckless defiance of doctrine was fast becoming a revolution in air warfare, and in the German High Command, panic was setting in. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's top fighter ace, wrote in his diary that week, "They no longer come to fight fair. They come to hunt." The hunters had been unleashed. February 25th, 1944, Luftwaffe headquarters, Berlin. The air in the underground command bunker was thick with smoke and despair. Maps covered the walls, each marked with red circles indicating lost squadrons, destroyed airfields, and crippled production centers. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's general of fighters, slammed his fist onto the table. "They're everywhere," he barked. "The Americans aren't escorting bombers anymore, they're hunting us in our own skies." Across the table, intelligence officers shuffled papers nervously. "We're losing aircraft faster than we can replace them, Herr General. The P-51 seconds are engaging our interceptors before they can even climb to altitude." Galland lit a cigarette, his hands trembling slightly. "What about reserves?" "Reserves?" another officer said bitterly. "We've no fuel to train them, no time to teach them. We're throwing boys into cockpits with 20 hours' experience against veterans who have 300. For the first time since the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe, once Europe's most feared air force, was collapsing under pressure. At the same hour, 25,000 feet above Germany, the sky was alive with silver and flame. Squadrons of P-51, Mustangs, the blue-nosed bastards of Bodny, the Oxford boys, and others swept through the contrails like wolves through a flock. "Bandits at 1 o'clock, high. Copy. Let's clean them out." Lieutenant William Wisner of the 352nd Fighter Group dove into a formation of Me 109 seconds trying to form up near Magdeburg. The Germans never saw him coming. He squeezed the trigger. 6. 50 caliber guns roared to life, tearing through a Messerschmitt's fuselage. The enemy plane burst into fire, spiraling into the clouds. Wisner climbed again, scanning the horizon. Everywhere he looked, Mustangs were diving, turning, firing, each encounter lasting seconds before the sky was littered with burning wreckage. Below, the bombers pressed on almost untouched, their black shadows drifting across the patchwork of fields and railways. For the men inside the B-17 seconds, it was like waking from a nightmare. The skies that had once been filled with enemies were now ruled by the steady rhythm of friendly fighters roaring above. 3 days later, Berlin. For the first time, the US 8th Air Force struck the German capital in broad daylight. The city's anti-aircraft batteries thundered, filling the sky with black flak bursts, but the Luftwaffe's fighter response was pitiful. Only a fraction of the expected interceptors arrived, many breaking off after losing half their number in the approach. Over 600 bombers reached their targets, rail yards, aircraft plants, and communication centers, reducing whole districts to rubble. German civilians stared upward in stunned disbelief. The invincible Reich had lost control of its own airspace. That evening, RAF Deben, England. The airfield was quiet except for the ticking of cooling engines. Ground crews moved among returning Mustangs, counting bullet holes, refueling, and patching. Pilots, exhausted but elated, slumped on the grass or smoked in silence. A jeep rolled to a stop near the flight line. Out stepped General Doolittle, coat collar turned up against the cold. His boots crunched across the frost as he approached one of the P-51 seconds, its nose art painted with a grinning devil and the words, "Ain't misbehavin'." "Whose bird is this?" he asked. Captain James Goodson, still wiping oil from his goggles, saluted. "Mine, sir." Doolittle smiled faintly. "How many today?" "3 confirmed, 1 probable. We hit the base at Lüneburg before they could scramble." Doolittle nodded. "Good work, Captain. That's 3 more who won't be waiting for us tomorrow." He turned to his operations officer. "Get me the kill ratio." "Preliminary figures, sir. 8 of ours down, over 200 of theirs confirmed destroyed." Doolittle's grin returned. "That's not a ratio," he said. "That's a reckoning." In the Luftwaffe's shattered fighter fields, the reckoning was clear. Charred airframes littered runways. Mechanics scavenged for spare parts under constant harassment from strafing Mustangs. Fuel convoys were bombed before reaching their destinations. The German pilots who survived returned to find their comrades gone, their replacements little more than terrified boys. Some refused to fly at all. The once mighty Jagdwaffe, the hunter arm, had become the hunted. Within 5 weeks of Doolittle's order, the Luftwaffe had lost over 2,600 aircraft, and more importantly, the irreplaceable core of its veteran pilots. Berlin's skies, once guarded by eagles, were now owned by the Stars and Stripes. But for Doolittle, this was only the beginning. His reckless strategy had broken Germany's wings, and soon those clear skies would open the door for D-Day. March 1944, Luftwaffe Training Command, Braunschweig. The snow had barely melted on the runways, but the smell of fuel and fear already filled the air. Rows of brand-new 192nd sat idle, their canopies covered with frost. Around them, teenage recruits shuffled nervously, clutching flight manuals with shaking hands. An instructor barked orders, voice hoarse. "You have 20 hours of flight time. Make them count. The Americans will not wait for you to learn." One of the boys, barely 18, raised his hand. "Sir, how long before we fight?" The instructor looked him dead in the eyes. "Tomorrow." The Luftwaffe was bleeding itself to death. In less than a month, it had lost the backbone of its experienced fighter corps. The replacements arriving now had no training in formation tactics, no survival instincts, and no hope of surviving a single encounter with Doolittle's Mustangs. By the end of March, the Luftwaffe's situation was catastrophic. Fuel reserves at 40% capacity, aircraft production crippled by bombing raids, veteran pilots dead or captured. The Reich sky, once a fortress, was now a graveyard. March 4. 1944, RAF Leisten, England. The dawn mission briefings were crisp, cold, and brutal. Target. Frankfurt. The operations officer began. Enemy air strength expected. Minimal. The room buzzed with disbelief. Minimal had never been a word associated with Germany's skies, but Doolittle's pilots knew better. They'd seen the panic in the enemy's movements, the scattered takeoffs, the desperate evasions, the empty airfields. Major John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group tapped his pencil on the map. "We'll go in first north sweep at 25,000 feet. Debden boys follow through the center. The Luftwaffe is finished. They just don't know it yet." Over Germany. Noon. Contrails painted the sky in white arcs. Below them, the industrial heart of the Reich lay wrapped in smoke and sirens. The Mustangs fanned out in loose formation hunters now by design, not accident. Red flight, tally-ho, bandits lifting from Wiesbaden. Meyer rolled into a dive, sunlight flashing off his canopy. He could see them 5W-190 climbing from the airstrip like desperate birds. He caught the lead plane at 3,000 feet and squeezed the trigger. Tracers stitched across the German's wing. Flames burst from its fuselage as it cartwheeled into the ground. "Splash one," he said calmly. Moments later, 2 more fell. The rest fled east, chased until their fuel ran out. When the bombers passed over Frankfurt 10 minutes later, the Luftwaffe was nowhere to be found. March 15th, 1944, Berlin. A messenger burst into the Air Ministry offices, his uniform stained with soot. "Herr General, our fighter command reports no aircraft available to intercept today's raid." The room froze. Outside, the low drone of bombers grew louder by the second. Moments later, the city shook as wave after wave of B-17 unloaded their payloads on rail yards, factories, and fuel depots. The Luftwaffe could no longer defend the heart of the Reich. That night, RAF High Wycombe, England. Rain lashed the windows as Doolittle studied the operations reports. His staff gathered silently around him, Colonel Cooter, Colonel Sparts, and several group commanders, their uniforms still stained with engine oil. "Losses?" Doolittle asked. 37 bombers, 12 fighters, enemy losses, approximately 400 aircraft destroyed or confirmed downed. Doolittle leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Gentlemen," he said finally, "we've done it." No one cheered. They didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew what those numbers meant. The Luftwaffe's back was broken. The airfields that had once launched interceptors against Allied bombers now lay cratered. The aircraft factories at Regensburg, Augsburg, and Kassel were rubble. Even the famed Messerschmitt Bf 109G, the pride of German engineering, was now a sitting duck. The reckless plan had worked. And yet, for Doolittle, the victory was not one of celebration, but of grim necessity. He knew what came next. The sky had been cleared, not for glory, but for invasion. March 25, 1944, RAF Debden. As the sun rose over England's green fields, mechanics prepared the next wave of sorties. The men joked, smoked, and checked their guns with practiced hands. General Doolittle walked the flight line slowly, stopping to shake hands, to look each pilot in the eye. He knew that these men, his men, had changed the war. "Sir," one of the pilots said, tightening his flight harness, "you think they'll ever call us heroes for this?" Doolittle smiled faintly. "No, they'll call you reckless, same as me." He paused, glancing toward the east. But history will know better. The engines roared to life, the air vibrating with power. Mustangs lifted into the dawn once more, no longer escorts, but predators, owning the very air that had once belonged to the enemy. Below, Doolittle watched them vanish into the clouds, hands clasped behind his back. He had gambled everything, his command, his reputation, his men, and won. The Luftwaffe was finished, and the road to Normandy was now open. April 1944, Münster, Germany. The once bustling Luftwaffe base was silent now, its hangars torn open, its runways cratered by bombs and strafing runs. Twisted wreckage of Me-109 and Flower 190 lay scattered across the field, wings melted, canopies shattered, machine guns still glinting faintly in the spring sunlight. A lone German mechanic walked among the ruins, his uniform streaked with oil and ash. He stopped beside the wreck of an aircraft whose tail still bore the faded black cross of the Reich. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's helmet lay untouched. He bowed his head. There were no words left to say. Overhead, contrails crossed the blue sky American bombers heading east, unchallenged. For the first time since the war began, no German fighters rose to meet them. At the same hour, 8th Air Force Headquarters, England. The operations board told the story better than any report could. Where once the maps were covered in red loss markers, now only a few scattered pins remained. Doolittle stood before his commanders, pointer in hand, voice steady but low. In January we were losing 1 bomber in 4. In March it was 1 in 10. Today, he paused, glancing toward the figures. We sent 700 bombers into Germany and lost 7. No applause followed, just quiet awe. Colonel Kuter leaned toward him. Sir, if this keeps up, there won't be a Luftwaffe left by summer. Doolittle nodded. That's the point. By the time our boys hit those beaches, the sky will already belong to them. Meanwhile, in Germany, General Adolf Galland sat alone in his office, his once proud posture sagging under the weight of reality. A half-burned cigarette smouldered in the ashtray beside a photograph of his fighter wing in 1940, smiling young men, confident, invincible. Most of them were dead now. An aide entered quietly, holding a telegram. Herr General, new orders from the Reich Air Ministry. Galland opened it without looking. It read simply, Fighter Command is to prioritize jet production. Stopgap measures for home defense. God help us. He crushed the paper in his fist. The Me-262 jet fighter, Germany's last hope, was still months from operational strength. And even when it came, there wouldn't be enough fuel, nor pilots, nor time. He whispered to no one in particular. We lost the war in the sky the moment Doolittle came. May 1944, England's southern coast. The preparations for Operation Overlord were in full swing. Across every airfield, rows of C-47 transports, P-47 seconds, and P-51 seconds waited like coiled muscles ready to spring. At Debden, the 4th Fighter Group held a rare day of rest. Pilots lounged beside their Mustangs, the smell of oil and rain hanging in the air. Major Donald Blakesley, his flight jacket unzipped, leaned against his plane, talking quietly with his wingmen. You know, he said, we've been fighting for months without really seeing what we've done. But look up there. He pointed toward the empty sky. Not a single enemy contrail, not a distant silhouette of a 109 or 190 nothing. That's what victory looks like. The younger pilot beside him nodded, expression somber. Feels strange, sir. Like we won, but we lost something too. Blakesley glanced toward the hangars, where a blackboard listed the names of pilots missing in action. Nearly half were gone. Yeah, he said quietly. We lost plenty. That night, General Doolittle walked the flight line one last time before the coming invasion. The wind carried the faint hum of idling engines and the scent of spring grass mixed with aviation fuel. He paused beside a Mustang, its fuselage marked with tiny swastikas, kill tallies from the pilots' victories. He rested a hand on the cool metal. The men who flew these machines were barely out of college, but they had done what no army in history had managed. They had wiped an enemy air force from the sky. Doolittle thought back to the day he'd taken command when they'd called him reckless, mad, arrogant. Now, even his critics in Washington admitted it. The mad general had saved the air war. He smiled faintly, whispering into the wind, sometimes madness is just the name they give courage. By summer, the once mighty Luftwaffe existed only on paper. Its few surviving pilots hid in forests or manned anti-aircraft guns. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion fleet crossed the Channel under a sky that was silent, vast, and wholly American. No enemy interceptors came. No bombers were lost to fighters. The sky, once Germany's greatest weapon, now belonged entirely to Doolittle's men. The reckless plan had become the blueprint for modern air supremacy, and the Luftwaffe, the terror of Europe, had been broken not by numbers alone, but by one man's refusal to play by the rules.